The West still carries with it the grand image of power, a shadow of former empires, the glow of victories past, and the aura of global dominance that it has long marketed to the world. Its media, its financial centers, its military presence, its technological corporations all radiate an impression of unstoppable control. But this is an illusion carefully polished and broadcasted to keep the perception alive even as the foundations crack. The spectacle of power is not the same as power itself, and it is in this widening gap between appearance and reality where the truth of decline begins to show. For decades, the West relied on storytelling as much as on hard assets. The narrative was that the West was the center of progress, the model others must follow, the culture others must consume, the system others must obey. Movies, brands, financial products, political slogans all reinforced this. The illusion became global currency. A nation could be drowning in debt, hollowed out by inequality, struggling with decaying infrastructure. But as long as Wall Street numbers flashed upward and Hollywood screens kept shining, the illusion of strength continued unchallenged. It was a performance staged, not just for the world, but for its own citizens too, convincing them that their dominance was eternal. Yet illusions require constant maintenance, and maintenance becomes harder when reality grows heavier. Look at the cities where skyscrapers stand tall. Behind the glass towers are neighborhoods crumbling from neglect. The West's wealth has always been showcased in symbols, luxury, power, influence, but the neglected foundations reveal a rot spreading underneath. Institutions once respected as unshakable pillars, universities, courts, parliaments, are now plagued with corruption, inefficiency, and polarization. What is shown to the world is a confident front, but what is hidden is a system unable to solve its own problems without creating new ones. The illusion is that the system is strong. The truth is that it is surviving on inertia. The military is another face of this illusion. The West parades its fleets, its aircraft, its global bases, its unmatched spending. The message is clear. No rival can compete with this arsenal. But history teaches that empires rarely collapse because of a single lost war. They collapse because the cost of maintaining dominance outgrows the capacity of the system. Rome did not fall the day its legions lost. It fell when the cost of sustaining the illusion of invincibility drained its treasury and eroded its unity. Today, endless wars, interventions, and defense budgets serve more as theater than as strategy. $1 trillion can be spent, but that does not mean the world bends to will. It only means the illusion must be funded at any cost, while the domestic needs of citizens remain ignored. The show of power continues, but it is a show performed for cameras, not for results. The illusion extends deeply into finance. Western financial markets are designed not to reflect reality, but to produce confidence. Numbers rise on screens, yet those numbers are detached from the real economy, where wages stagnate, costs rise, and inequality deepens. Governments and central banks step in to inject liquidity, to inflate assets, to keep the show running. It is a magician's trick, redirecting the audience's eyes while the trick collapses behind the curtain. The illusion tells investors the system is stable, that growth is endless, that collapse is impossible. But when an economy requires constant injections of artificial energy just to stand upright, it is not strong, it is fragile. The strength is only on paper, never in the streets where people live. Culture, too, has been used as a weapon of illusion. The West projects its lifestyle as the dream, its music as the standard, its fashion as the aspiration, its language as the necessity, Generations across the world grew up consuming this culture and equating it with superiority. Yet within Western societies themselves, cultural decay is evident. Communities are fractured, families broken, loneliness widespread, trust in institutions at record lows. The culture that was once exported as a shining example is now plagued with its own contradictions. Addiction, violence, polarization, identity conflicts, all eating away at the very societies that claim to lead the world. The illusion of cultural dominance hides the reality of internal fragmentation. Technology is perhaps the most deceptive illusion. The West points to its tech giants, its dominance in innovation, its breakthroughs in AI and digital platforms. But behind the glossy surface of apps and devices lies a dependence on global supply chains, on resources mined in distant lands, on manufacturing outsourced elsewhere. The illusion is that technology proves strength. The reality is that even the most advanced platforms rely on fragile networks that the West does not fully control. When chips, minerals, and factories are concentrated outside its borders, then the strength of technology becomes less about dominance and more about dependency. The West shows off innovation while quietly fearing the moment when control slips into the hands of others. Politics, said Paris, with the illusion of strength, cracks the loudest. Democracies, once praised as stable and ideal, now display paralysis, dysfunction, and division. Elections become spectacles of anger rather than exercises in leadership. Legislatures are gridlocked, unable to address the most basic needs of their citizens. The illusion presented to the world is one of freedom and leadership, but the reality is bitter division and the erosion of trust in the very institutions that once claimed legitimacy. Every televised debate, every headline, every viral clip tries to mask this decline, but the mask cannot forever conceal the cracks widening beneath. The illusion works only if the world continues to believe it, and here lies the deepest danger. Outside the West, many are no longer convinced. Nations once obedient are now questioning. Alliances once unshakable are now fragile, and rivals once weak are now stronger. The illusion may still capture headlines, but in boardrooms, parliaments, and streets across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the belief is fading. And when belief fades, power collapses faster than expected. Strength is not measured by what is shown. It is measured by what others still accept. The West continues to show strength, but fewer are willing to accept it as reality. This illusion is not merely political or economic. It is psychological. The West believes in its own myth, clinging to the idea that history will always bend in its favor. But myths are dangerous when they blind societies to reality. A society convinced of its eternal dominance cannot prepare for decline. A leadership trapped in illusions cannot adjust to new realities. Citizens raised on the belief of superiority cannot understand when their lives become harder, when their systems falter, when their privileges evaporate. The shock of reality, when it breaks through the illusion, is not gradual. It is sudden, and it is devastating. The illusion of strength is powerful because it sustains confidence long after the real strength has waned. But illusions, no matter how carefully constructed, cannot resist reality forever. The gap between what is displayed and what is lived is widening too quickly. The skyscraper still stands, but its foundation is hollow. The flag still waves, but the people beneath it are divided. The market still rises, but the streets grow restless. The illusion still shines, but the light is dimming with every passing day. The modern West has built its entire economic engine on a foundation of debt. A machine that once appeared ingenious, but now reveals itself as a trap tightening around its own neck. Debt was once seen as a tool, a temporary measure to fuel investment, to fund expansion, to lubricate growth. But over time, it became the very lifeblood of the system. Instead of producing real wealth through tangible industry and sustainable innovation, the West has leaned on borrowing, printing, and inflating its way forward. What was meant to be an instrument has become an addiction. And like all addictions, the craving grows stronger while the body grows weaker. At the core of this dependency lies the financial architecture of endless money creation. Central banks became the magicians, conjuring liquidity out of thin air, assuring the public that debt was manageable, that deficits did not matter, that the printing press could always keep the illusion alive. Each crisis, whether financial collapse, pandemic, or geopolitical tension, was met not with reform, but with more debt. The medicine for each sickness was the same injection of borrowed capital, but the medicine, instead of curing the disease, only prolonged it, and in prolonging it, made the system more fragile. Governments across the Western world operate under budgets that are not budgets in any real sense. Revenues rarely match expenditures, and the difference is perpetually filled by issuing new bonds, selling promises of future repayment. These promises stack upon old promises, and soon the interest payments themselves become a burden greater than the original spending. The debt is rolled over, refinanced, extended, but never repaid. Generations are born into a system where their taxes are already mortgaged to cover the interest on debts accumulated before they even entered the world. This is not the functioning of a strong economy. It is the functioning of a household that keeps buying new credit cards to pay off the old ones. The dependency deepens because the system has no alternative path left. Real growth is too slow. Real productivity gains are too small. And real industries have been hollowed out by outsourcing and financial speculation. To show strength, debt must expand. To show stability, the printing must continue. The financial markets, addicted to cheap money, panic at the slightest hint of tightening. Stocks plunge when interest rates rise by even a fraction. Politicians tremble at the thought of austerity because citizens accustomed to borrowed prosperity revolt when the illusion is even partially lifted. Thus, the cycle feeds itself. More borrowing to maintain appearances, more printing to calm markets, more promises to cover old failures. This trap is visible in the way crises are handled. When banks collapse under the weight of reckless speculation, they are bailed out not with accountability, but with more public debt. When housing bubbles burst, the solution is to lower interest rates further, encouraging yet another bubble. When consumption falters, stimulus checks and subsidies are sent out, financed not by savings, but by borrowing from the future. Each problem is temporarily masked, but the cure only feeds the disease. The economy becomes less about creating real goods and services and more about sustaining the illusion of growth through credit. Debt dependency is not only economic, it is also political. Leaders win elections, not by offering painful reforms, but by promising benefits that must be funded by borrowing. Voters demand immediate comfort, not long-term sustainability, and politicians deliver by expanding deficits. Military budgets expand even when treasuries are empty. Social programs multiply even when revenues decline. Infrastructure projects are announced with grandeur, but funded by debt that will burden the future. The short-term logic of politics collides with the long-term reality of economics, and debt becomes the bridge used to cross that chasm. But bridges built on paper promises eventually collapse when the weight becomes too great. The most dangerous aspect of this dependency is how normalized it has become. Economists on television, reassure the public that debt to GDP ratios can always be adjusted, that inflation is temporary, that central banks will manage everything with sophisticated tools. Citizens are told not to worry, that deficits are the way of modern economies, that growth will return tomorrow to pay for today's borrowing, but growth no longer keeps pace, and the tomorrow they speak of never arrives. What was once considered dangerous levels of debt decades ago are now dismissed as routine. Numbers that once triggered alarm are now waved away with technical jargon. The trap works because it convinces the prisoner that the chains are harmless. The dependency has also distorted society itself. Easy credit encourages overconsumption. Citizens are lured into personal debt, mortgages, student loans, credit cards, believing that borrowing is the path to prosperity. Entire generations are buried under obligations they cannot escape, their futures mortgaged just like their governments. The culture of debt becomes ingrained, where saving is mocked as outdated and borrowing is celebrated as progress. This cultural shift ensures that the dependency is not only institutional but personal, not only financial but psychological. A society that believes debt is wealth is one that has lost touch with reality. Internationally, this trap erodes credibility. The West preaches fiscal responsibility to others while drowning in its own deficits. It pressures weaker economies to adopt austerity while refusing to adopt it itself. It weaponizes its currencies through sanctions and controls. But the very overuse of this power accelerates the search for alternatives. The dollar and the euro remain strong only because of inertia. But as debt grows without limit, confidence weakens. The trap is not only visible to insiders, but also to outsiders who begin to prepare for a world where Western currencies no longer dominate. The cycle of dependency narrows options over time. Raising interest rates risks collapsing over leveraged markets. Cutting spending risks political backlash and social unrest. Printing more money risks runaway inflation. Doing nothing risks slow stagnation and eventual implosion. Every path leads to pain, yet the system avoids making any hard choice. Instead, it continues the same ritual. Borrow more, spend more, print more, promise more. It is a path that postpones collapse, but each postponement makes the eventual collapse more violent. The debt dependency trap is the silent enemy, invisible in daily life, yet shaping every aspect of it. Citizens go to work, politicians debate, markets fluctuate, but behind it all is the ever-expanding weight of obligations that can never truly be repaid. The system functions not because it is strong, but because everyone has agreed to pretend the debt is sustainable. This pretense sustains the illusion of prosperity, but illusions cannot last forever when the foundation is built on numbers that grow faster than reality can support. The story of decline is never written in just one chapter. It is not simply a matter of losing battles abroad or suffering economic setbacks at home. True decline emerges when internal weaknesses and external pressures converge at the same time, feeding into each other, creating a spiral that no nation or empire can easily escape. The West today finds itself trapped in precisely such a moment. Internally, it is struggling with fractures that have grown too wide to ignore: political polarization, cultural fragmentation, economic inequality, and the erosion of trust in institutions. Externally, it faces the rise of new powers, alliances, and systems that no longer bow to its influence. The combination is deadly because internal decay reduces resilience just as external pressure intensifies. It is this dual force, pressing from within and without, that accelerates the fading of Western power faster than anyone anticipated. Internally, the divisions within Western societies have become structural, not temporary. Politics has descended into a theater of hostility rather than governance. The promise of democracy was that debate would produce compromise. But what exists now is paralysis. Legislatures are gridlocked. Policies swing violently from one administration to another, and citizens live in echo chambers that feed resentment instead of unity. Every election becomes a battle for survival, not a choice of vision. The system that once projected stability now projects chaos, and in that chaos, the ability to respond to crises weakens. Internal decay is not only seen in government, but in the very social fabric, where communities fragment and shared values erode. Without cohesion at home, strength abroad becomes unsustainable. Cultural decay adds another layer. The West once prided itself on cultural confidence, exporting its way of life as a universal model. But within its own borders, culture is consumed by division. Identity politics tears societies into competing camps, each demanding recognition but refusing compromise. Social media amplifies outrage, rewarding anger more than dialogue, conflict more than consensus. Entertainment industries distract with spectacle, while deeper problems go unresolved. What once unified citizens under a common narrative of progress now divides them into groups that distrust each other, creating fertile ground for instability. This cultural fragmentation weakens the very idea of a collective identity. And when identity collapses, societies become vulnerable to forces beyond their control. Economically, inequality has widened into a chasm. A small elite benefits from globalization, technological dominance, and financial speculation, while the majority sees stagnation or decline. Wages fail to keep up with costs, housing becomes unaffordable, healthcare drains savings, and debt chains entire generations. The promise that hard work leads to prosperity is broken. Citizens no longer believe that the system serves them, and when faith in economic fairness disappears, loyalty to institutions collapses. This economic decay does not exist in isolation. It spills into politics, fuels anger, drives protests, and opens the door for movements that challenge the status quo. Internal instability grows as citizens lose patience with a system that appears rigged against them. Institutional trust is at historic lows. Courts are viewed as politicized, media as biased, universities as ideological. Once these institutions provided stability by serving as neutral ground, but now they are distrusted by large segments of the population. Without trusted institutions, citizens cannot rally around common solutions during crises. The pandemic revealed this clearly. Governments divided, citizens resisted authority, and misinformation spread faster than official guidance. The system that once claimed to embody rational governance instead displayed dysfunction. The internal decay of trust ensures that even when leaders attempt to act, they do so on fractured ground. All of this internal decay might still be managed if external conditions were favorable, but they are not. The external world is shifting rapidly, and it no longer bends to Western dictates. Emerging powers are asserting themselves with confidence, building alliances that bypass Western influence. The rise of blocs like BRICS is a direct challenge to the economic dominance once monopolized by Western institutions. Countries once forced into dependency now have alternatives, new banks, new trade routes, new currencies. Each new alliance erodes the West's ability to dictate terms. The external pressure grows stronger precisely at the moment when internal weakness is at its peak. Externally, military dominance is also being tested. The West still maintains vast arsenals and global bases, but its ability to dictate outcomes through force has diminished. Conflicts drag on without resolution. Interventions create more instability than stability, and rivals grow more skilled at resisting. The image of invincibility that once silenced opposition no longer holds the same weight. Rivals adapt with asymmetrical strategies, technological advancements, and new alliances that neutralize Western advantages. The external pressure is not about defeating the West in a single confrontation, but about draining its capacity over time, knowing that the internal fractures will magnify the exhaustion. Geopolitically, the West faces a world less willing to accept its narratives. For decades, it framed itself as the champion of freedom, democracy, and human rights. But the contradictions of its own actions, wars fought under false pretenses, alliances with dictators, domestic violations of rights, have eroded credibility. Other nations point out these hypocrisies and use them to resist Western influence. The external pressure is not only material but moral, as the world questions whether the West has the authority to lead when it cannot embody the values it preaches. Without moral authority, even allies begin to drift, hedging their bets, seeking balance between East and West. Technology, once the West's unchallenged domain, now fuels external pressure as well. The rise of non-Western tech ecosystems means that the monopoly on digital platforms, artificial intelligence, and telecommunications is broken. Nations once dependent on Silicon Valley now have their own giants, their own infrastructure, their own innovations. The West faces not only competition, but also exclusion, as alternative systems lock it out of markets and partnerships. The external challenge in technology strikes at the heart of Western influence, which for decades relied on being the gatekeeper of global innovation. Energy is another front where external pressure builds. For too long, the West relied on controlling energy flows to maintain influence. But the shift in global energy markets, the rise of new producers, and the creation of alternative trade networks weaken that control. Nations once vulnerable to energy sanctions or disruptions now diversify their sources, build regional agreements, and reduce dependence. The West's leverage diminishes while its own energy needs leave it exposed to shocks it cannot easily absorb. The external world, more self-sufficient than before, no longer bows to the same pressures. The most dangerous convergence is that internal decay makes external pressure far more destructive. A united, confident society might withstand outside challenges, adapt, and recover. But a divided, fragile society crumbles more easily under the same weight. When politics is paralyzed, external rivals exploit it. When culture is fragmented, foreign narratives find fertile ground. When inequality breeds resentment, external systems appear more attractive by comparison. The weaknesses inside the West amplify the pressures outside, creating a cycle where decline accelerates with every passing year. This convergence is not accidental, but inevitable. History has shown that empires rarely collapse solely because of external conquest. They fall because internal rot leaves them unable to resist external shocks. The West now faces that historic moment where decay at home and pressure abroad feed each other, reducing the margin for survival. The question is no longer whether one force or the other will dominate, but how quickly their interaction will reshape the global balance. The trap is set by the very forces of history, and the West finds itself caught between a crumbling inside and an unforgiving outside. The West has long relied not only on military strength, economic power, or technological edge, but also on the dominance of narratives. Narratives are more than stories. They are belief systems, frameworks through which both citizens and the wider world interpret events. For generations, the West controlled these narratives with unmatched skill. Democracy was framed as the ultimate form of governance. Free markets were described as the inevitable path to prosperity. Innovation was said to flow naturally from Western creativity. Freedom of speech and human rights were declared as the guiding lights of civilization. These narratives were powerful because they gave legitimacy to Western leadership, convincing not only others but also themselves that their dominance was justified and destined to last. But the cracks in these stories are now too deep to hide, and as these narratives collapse, so too does the moral authority that once propped up Western power. The narrative of democracy was perhaps the strongest pillar. It promised accountability, transparency, and the empowerment of citizens. The image of free elections, free press, and independent institutions became the exportable model that the West used to pressure other nations into compliance. Yet within Western societies, democracy is no longer a symbol of stability, but a theater of dysfunction. Elections are marred by disinformation, polarization, and distrust. Political campaigns are funded by vast sums of money from elites and corporations, raising questions about whose interests truly govern policy. Citizens see legislatures unable to pass meaningful reforms, governments shutting down due to budget deadlocks, and leaders more focused on attacking opponents than solving problems. The narrative that democracy ensures effective governance collapses when the system itself appears incapable of delivering basic results. The very concept once used to inspire and dominate now struggles to convince even those who live under it. The narrative of free markets has also lost its credibility. For decades, the West insisted that open competition and deregulation would generate prosperity for all. This story was used to dismantle barriers, privatize industries, and integrate economies globally under Western-led institutions. But in practice, free markets delivered uneven results. Wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, corporations grew larger than entire nations, and monopolies suffocated competition. Far from being free, markets became manipulated by financial giants whose speculative moves could crash entire economies overnight. Citizens who once believed in the promise of upward mobility now find themselves locked in stagnation while the elite reap the rewards of globalization. The narrative collapses because lived reality no longer matches the promise. The very system sold as a path to fairness is now viewed as rigged, and when faith in the fairness of markets dies, the legitimacy of the broader economic order erodes with it. Another narrative was that of Western innovation. The West claimed to be the birthplace of modern science, technology, and cultural progress, presenting itself as the engine of human advancement. Silicon Valley, Hollywood, and elite universities all symbolized this dominance. The story was that without Western creativity, the world would stagnate. Yet, this narrative falters as innovation spreads globally. Asia produces its own tech giants. Africa pioneers its own digital solutions. Latin America builds its own industries. The myth that innovation is uniquely Western collapses when alternatives emerge outside its borders. Even within the West, much of what is called innovation is exposed as iteration, where platforms monetize attention rather than create real progress. A society producing endless apps for distraction, while struggling with decaying infrastructure, cannot convincingly claim to be the vanguard of advancement. The story of unique brilliance fades when others innovate faster and solve real problems more effectively. Human rights, freedom of speech formed perhaps the most emotionally powerful narrative. The West presented itself as the defender of individual liberty, as the champion of dignity, as the voice of the voiceless against authoritarianism. This narrative was invoked to justify interventions, sanctions, and diplomatic pressure. But the credibility of this story collapses under the weight of contradictions. Wars waged in the name of freedom destroyed entire nations. Alliances with oppressive regimes revealed hypocrisy. Domestic violations of privacy, mass surveillance, systemic racism, and political censorship undermined the claim of moral superiority. When citizens within Western societies protest against injustice and are met with repression, the narrative rings hollow. When the West supports dictators abroad while preaching democracy at home, the story becomes unbelievable. The collapse of this narrative is perhaps the most damaging because it undermines the moral legitimacy that once allowed the West to lead not just by force, but by persuasion. The fall of narratives also extends to the myth of endless growth. For decades, Western economies promised that each generation would live better than the last, that progress was a straight line upward. This story justified the sacrifices demanded of citizens as they were told the future would reward them. But today, younger generations face the opposite reality: stagnant wages, unaffordable housing, overwhelming debt, and shrinking opportunities. The promise of abundance has been replaced by the fear of decline. The story that growth would lift all boats collapses when entire populations feel abandoned by the system. And once the belief in progress is broken, disillusionment spreads quickly, corroding trust not only in governments but in the entire structure of society. The Western control of global narratives depended heavily on its media dominance. Hollywood movies, news networks, publishing houses, and academic institutions spread Western perspectives across the globe, framing them as objective truths. The West became not only the storyteller, but the gatekeeper of global understanding. Yet this monopoly no longer holds. Independent media from other regions, alternative platforms, and social networks now challenge the Western frame of reality. Stories once unquestioned are now dissected, criticized, and rejected by audiences that see the bias. Global citizens no longer rely on Western media to interpret the world. They have their own voices, their own lenses, their own truths. The collapse of media dominance accelerates the fall of narratives because the authority to define reality slips from Western hands. What makes the fall of these narratives so dangerous is that they were never just external tools. They were internal anchors as well. Western societies themselves believed these stories, drawing strength and cohesion from them. Citizens believed in democracy, in fairness of markets, in the promise of innovation, in the moral authority of their institutions. These beliefs created unity and justified sacrifice. But as each narrative collapses, cynicism replaces trust, fragmentation replaces unity, and apathy replaces engagement. A society that no longer believes in its own stories becomes fragile, vulnerable, not only to external challenges, but also to internal disintegration. Externally, the collapse of these narratives leaves the West without persuasive power. Allies begin to question loyalty when the stories that once bound them no longer resonate. Rivals exploit the hypocrisy, pointing out contradictions and building alternative narratives that appeal to a global audience tired of Western dominance. The competition is not only in economics or technology, but in the realm of ideas, and in that competition, the West no longer holds the commanding position. The authority to tell the world what is right, what is just, what is inevitable, has slipped away. Without these narratives, military might and financial dominance lose much of their effectiveness because power without belief is brittle, unsustainable, and short-lived. The fall of narratives is the silent collapse, less visible than wars or financial crashes, but far more profound. For centuries, the West led not only through force, but through belief. It convinced the world that its system was universal, that its future was the world's future, that its values were the only path forward. But when narratives no longer match reality, they cease to inspire and begin to decay. The power of storytelling, once the greatest weapon of Western dominance, now turns against it, exposing contradictions, eroding trust, and leaving behind a void that no amount of propaganda can fill. For much of history, decline was imagined as a slow process, stretching over generations, giving empires time to adjust, to reform, or to at least prolong their existence through temporary measures. The West comforted itself with this belief, assuming that even if its supremacy were to fade, it would do so gradually over decades, leaving space to maneuver and space to adapt. But what is unfolding now is not gradual erosion, but rapid acceleration. The pace of change is no longer linear. It is exponential. Trends that once took decades now unfold in years. Shifts in power that were expected in the distant future are arriving with alarming speed. The collapse of confidence, the rise of rivals, the exposure of fragilities, all converge to push the West down a slope far steeper than its own strategists had anticipated. The acceleration of decline is the most unsettling reality because it removes the illusion of time, leaving no margin for slow adjustment, only the shock of sudden consequence. One key driver of this acceleration is the compounding effect of crises. In the past, an empire might face one crisis at a time: economic stagnation, political turmoil, or military defeat, but rarely all at once. The West today faces overlapping crises that magnify each other. Economic instability fuels political polarization, political dysfunction deepens social fragmentation, social unrest reduces the capacity to respond to global challenges, and global challenges feed back into economic instability. This cycle is self-reinforcing, each weakness amplifying the next, collapsing timelines that once seemed manageable. What was once thought to be a century-long shift of power now appears compressed into a single generation. The machinery of decline spins faster because every part of it is interconnected. Technology is another accelerator. Digital networks amplify everything: information, disinformation, panic, protests at a speed unimaginable in previous eras. A financial shock spreads through global markets within minutes. A political scandal destabilizes governments overnight. A viral protest movement challenges regimes in days. The very tools that once gave the West dominance in communication and information now serve as accelerants of instability, exposing weaknesses instantly, magnifying contradictions, and destroying the possibility of controlling narratives. In earlier times, decline could be hidden or managed through slow communication and limited awareness. Now, every failure is globalized in real time, stripping away the ability to manage perception and eroding confidence faster than institutions can respond. The acceleration is visible in the economy. Debt levels that once took decades to build now double in a matter of years. Inflation, once creeping slowly, now spikes in months. Supply chain disruptions ripple instantly across continents, revealing vulnerabilities that cannot be repaired quickly. Asset bubbles inflate faster, crash harder, and leave less time for recovery. The speed of financial markets driven by algorithms and speculative capital, ensures that confidence collapses far faster than it can be restored. A single decision by a central bank can trigger chaos across the globe within hours. The West built its financial dominance on control and predictability, but the velocity of the system now makes stability impossible. The structures designed to manage gradual cycles are overwhelmed by rapid shocks. Externally, the acceleration comes from the rise of alternatives that no longer wait patiently for the West to adjust. The growth of non-Western economies, the creation of parallel financial systems, the expansion of alternative trade routes, and the building of independent technologies are all happening simultaneously. Rivals no longer see the West as unchallengeable, and this confidence accelerates their actions. They move quickly to establish new alliances, new currencies, new institutions, knowing that the West cannot respond with the same speed. The more agile the external world becomes, the slower and more cumbersome the West appears, trapped in bureaucratic paralysis and ideological debates, while the ground shifts beneath it. Cultural acceleration is equally evident. Trust that took centuries to build erodes within a decade. Institutions once revered for stability now collapse under scandal after scandal. Citizens who once tolerated slow reforms now demand immediate change. And when change fails to arrive, they abandon faith altogether. Movements that would have taken years to organize now erupt within days through digital mobilization. The cycle of outrage, protest, and disillusionment moves too fast for traditional politics to absorb. Leaders are elected and discarded with dizzying speed. Policies are announced and reversed almost instantly. And long-term vision evaporates in the face of constant short-term turbulence. This cultural acceleration destroys the very idea of continuity, leaving societies spinning in a cycle of perpetual instability. Geopolitically, acceleration is felt in the shrinking window of influence. Decades ago, the West could rely on long-term alliances, treaties, and institutions to sustain its dominance. But today, allies shift positions quickly, hedging between East and West, unwilling to tie their futures to a power invisible decline. Agreements once assumed permanent unravel rapidly as nations reassess their interests in real time. The global order, once built on slow-moving stability, now shifts with the speed of changing circumstances. The West is no longer the anchor of predictability, but a player scrambling to keep up with accelerating change. One of the deepest accelerators is the psychological collapse of confidence. Empires survive longer than expected, not because they remain strong, but because people continue to believe in their strength. Once that belief erodes, decline accelerates. The West today faces precisely this erosion. Citizens no longer trust their leaders. Allies no longer trust promises. Rivals no longer fear threats. The speed at which this confidence evaporates shocks even insiders. Once faith is broken, it does not return gradually. It vanishes suddenly, leaving institutions hollow. The acceleration of decline is at its core the acceleration of disbelief in the system itself. The illusion of gradual decline was comforting because it allowed leaders to delay difficult decisions. They could imagine reforms spread out over decades, costs postponed, sacrifices minimized, but acceleration makes delay impossible. Problems that were once deferred now arrive all at once. Climate disasters intensify faster than adaptation. Migration pressures grow faster than integration. Economic imbalances widen faster than redistribution. Geopolitical challenges multiply faster than diplomacy. The system is overwhelmed by the speed of crises, unable to address one before the next erupts. Decline no longer unfolds like a slow erosion of stone, but like a dam breaking. with floodwaters rushing faster than anyone can control. Acceleration also exposes the fragility of institutions built for another era. Constitutions, treaties, bureaucracies, and markets were all designed with the assumption of gradual change, with the idea that stability was the natural state and disruptions rare. But when disruptions become constant and accelerating, these institutions fail. They cannot adapt to the velocity of modern crises, and their very slowness becomes a liability. The West is caught in structures that move at the pace of the past, while the present races ahead. This mismatch ensures that decline does not move slowly, but quickly, as outdated systems collapse under the strain of rapid change. History rarely announces turning points with precision, but acceleration makes them unavoidable. The signs of decay that could once be dismissed as temporary now compound too quickly to ignore. Every year of inaction becomes a decade of consequences. Every illusion of stability collapses sooner than expected. Every weakness accelerates the impact of the next. The West believed it had time, but time is the one resource that acceleration removes. The decline is no longer measured in centuries or decades, but in years unfolding before the world, with a speed that leaves no space for complacency, no room for denial, and no comfort in delay. Every empire, every civilization that reached the height of its influence eventually faced a moment when the signs of decline could no longer be ignored. For the West, that moment is no longer in the distance. It is here, pressing urgently against every institution, every economy, every narrative that once sustained its dominance. This is not just another cycle in history where temporary setbacks are followed by renewed growth. This is not the kind of turbulence that can be dismissed as seasonal or transitional. What is unfolding is a structural transformation of global power, a shift that will not reverse, a turning point that forces recognition. The final call is the realization that the world built around Western supremacy is ending, and that denial will not postpone the consequences. The call comes first through the collapse of credibility. For generations, the West maintained authority, not only by force, but by persuasion, by convincing others that its systems were the model of progress, that its values were universal, that its leadership was inevitable. Today, that credibility is shattered. Nations that once accepted Western dictates now openly resist them, forming alliances that bypass the traditional order. Citizens within Western societies themselves no longer trust their governments, their media, or their institutions. When both internal and external audiences stop believing, the foundation of influence disintegrates. The final call is the sound of belief evaporating, leaving behind raw power without legitimacy. The call also resounds in the economy. For decades, the West dominated through control of finance, trade, and currency. The dollar, the euro, and the systems surrounding them acted as levers of global control. But the machinery that sustained this dominance is breaking down. Debt spirals out of control, inflation eats away at savings, and rivals build parallel systems that reduce dependence on Western currencies. Every sanction meant to demonstrate power instead accelerates the search for alternatives. The authority of Western finance rests on the assumption that it is unshakable, but the cracks are visible. The final call is the recognition that economic dominance built on unsustainable debt and manipulated confidence cannot last. Politically, the call is unmistakable. Democracies, once admired, are now ridiculed for dysfunction, gridlock, polarization, corruption, and endless cycles of partisan warfare reveal a system incapable of decisive action. Governments fail to respond effectively to crises. Citizens lose faith in the very process that was supposed to represent them. And institutions once seen as stabilizing forces are now distrusted. Abroad, the claim of moral superiority no longer convinces, as hypocrisy is exposed in wars fought without justification, in alliances with regimes that betray the very values preached. The final call is the collapse of the story that the West leads, because it governs better. A collapse that strips away the last justification for hegemony. Externally, the rise of new powers amplifies the urgency of this moment. For centuries, the West could claim supremacy because no rival possessed the capacity to match it in military, economic, or cultural terms. That era is over. Asia grows faster, innovates faster, and builds alliances with determination. Nations across Africa and Latin America look elsewhere for models of development and partnership. The monopoly on leadership is broken. The final call is the sound of the global South refusing to remain subordinate. The sound of alternative systems gaining traction. The sound of a world rearranging itself without waiting for Western approval. The speed of the shift makes the call even louder. Decline was once expected to stretch across generations, but acceleration has turned decades into years. Crises compound quickly. Technology amplifies shocks instantly, and confidence evaporates overnight. The assumption that there was time to adapt is gone. The world no longer moves at the pace of past empires. The final call is not gradual. It is urgent, forcing recognition that the time for adjustment has already passed. Socially, the call is echoed in the disillusionment of Western citizens. Entire generations grow up burdened with debt, locked out of housing markets, watching wages stagnate while costs rise. The promise that each generation would live better than the last is broken. Trust in leaders evaporates, cultural fragmentation deepens, and the sense of shared identity dissolves. A society that no longer believes in its own future cannot project strength abroad. The final call is heard in the streets of Western cities where protest and unrest reveal the cracks that can no longer be hidden behind slogans of progress. The call reverberates through culture as well. For decades, Western media dominated the global imagination, shaping dreams, values, and aspirations. Today, that dominance is fractured. Stories from other parts of the world compete for attention. New platforms bypass old gatekeepers, and the authority to define truth no longer belongs to the West alone. Even within its own borders, culture becomes fragmented, unable to unify citizens around common narratives. The final call is the loss of control over the story of the future, a story that once gave the West its soft power but now slips from its hands. At its core, the final call is a warning about denial. The West has long assumed that history bends in its favor, that temporary crises will always be followed by a recovery, that its supremacy is natural and inevitable. This belief has delayed action, postponed reform, and deepened fragility. But history does not reward denial. When internal decay and external pressure converge, when credibility collapses and rivals rise, when narratives shatter and economies falter, the outcome is not renewal but transformation. The final call is the moment when denial is no longer possible, when reality breaks through illusions, when the system can no longer pretend that time is on its side. This call is not just about geopolitics or economics. It is about the end of an era, The structures built after World War II, the institutions designed to enshrine Western dominance, the ideologies that framed its supremacy, all are fading. The balance of power is shifting irreversibly, and with it, the very framework of the modern world. The final call is not an invitation to negotiate the terms of decline, but a declaration that decline is already underway, that the world is already rearranging itself, and that the old order cannot be restored. The urgency of the call lies in its finality. There is no second warning, no further delay, no chance to reset the clock. Every signal has already been given. A collapsing trust, accelerating debt, rising rivals, disillusioned citizens, fractured culture, weakened alliances. To ignore these signals is not just blindness, but surrender. The final call is the culmination of centuries of dominance, reduced now to its last moment of choice. The final recognition that the structures of power, once thought eternal, are dissolving in real time, leaving behind a world that will no longer be defined by Western supremacy.